His wife yawned, and then yawned again a minute later, and put the cover on her work basket and gathered up her mending. "I declare it's snowing," she said. She got up and went into the bedroom, and he sat looking at the snow, which was coming down in big cottony flakes. "Aren't you coming, Lloyd?" He turned the wick down until the lamp sputtered and went out. Then he went into the next room and, sitting on the edge of the bed, began to undress. "As long as she doesn't know how I feel about her." He kissed her eyelids. "Now, why would you want to do a thing like that?" Clarence asked. "Well, land is cheap, for one thing. I could own my own farm and raise what I pleased on it, and not have to share the profits. Or the losses in a bad year. You've been on the Stroud place all your life. It's home to you. You know everybody for miles around, and they know you. If you get into trouble, you can expect help." "True enough," Lloyd Wilson said soberly. He knew that if Clarence didn't say, "Help from me," it was because he didn't want to remind him how beholden he was. Who knows what it's like in Iowa? You may find that people are friendly out there, and then again, they may not be. What Fern felt, he could not make out. Nothing, maybe. Maybe she resented his friendship with Clarence and would be glad if he moved away. She was standing at the stove with an apron on, rinsing the supper dishes in a pan of hot water. She had moved the lamp to a shelf higher than her head, and the light fell on the nape of her neck, the place that in women and small children always seemed to express their vulnerability. Looking at the soft blonde hairs that had escaped from the comb, he thought of all those people who, because of their religion, had knelt down in great perturbation of mind and had their heads chopped off. His heart was flooded with love for her, and he lost the thread of what Clarence was saying. Riding into town with him, Clarence said, "Fern's as cross as a bear this morning." "Yes," he said, trying to seem no more interested than if Clarence had said he had to replace some part in the manure spreader. "I wish I knew what's eating her." "Maybe nothing. Maybe she's just tired or doesn't feel well. Maybe. In any case, I doubt if she's the only woman in Logan County that's as cross as a bear this morning." "There's no pleasing her sometimes," Clarence said, and there the conversation ended. But it had opened up vistas of hope where before there had been none. Parting the slit in the front of his underwear, he sent his urine in an arch out onto the frozen ground. It glittered in the moonlight. He was in the shadow of the porch roof, where he could not be seen by anybody driving past, though who would be before daylight. With one knee bent and his foot braced against the porch railing, he stood staring off into the darkness where she was. A minute passed, and then another. The first cock crowed, even though the light in the east hadn't changed. At his back, a woman's voice said, "Lloyd, what on earth are you doing out there?" And he turned and went into the house. He thought his secret was safe, until one day, when he walked into the kitchen and asked, "Where's Clarence?" And she said coldly, "Why do you keep up this pretense of friendship any longer, when you don't like us the way you used to?" He was dumbfounded, and started to defend himself, and then broke off. If he didn't say what was on his heart now, he might as well crawl into a hole somewhere and die. His life wouldn't be worth living. Out it came, everything, pouring out of him. He expected to be driven from the house, and instead she looked at him the way she looked at her children when they were upset over something, as if, as a human being, he had a right to his feelings, whatever they were. When he took her in his arms, she neither accepted his kiss nor resisted it. Instinct told him that it would end badly. For a week they avoided each other, and accident kept bringing them face to face when there was nobody else around. Each time they turned away without saying a word, without even touching each other, and got in deeper and deeper. He knew he should be sorry, but he was not, which didn't keep him from grieving for the best friend he had ever had, as if Clarence had met with an accident. The flood of feeling that informed his heart was like nothing he'd ever experienced. If his wife, lying with her back to him on the far side of the bed, knew he was awake, she did not show it. Reassured by the sound of her breathing, he lit a match and looked to see what time it was. He had never before not been able to fall asleep the minute his head hit the pillow. Now, hour after hour went by, and he felt no need for sleep. He felt as if he had just been born. He lay on his side for a while and then turned, trying not to produce an upheaval in the bed. If things had been different, if they'd met when they were young, before Clarence had come along, and... He turned again. He was in the habit of going to his father when he had a problem to deal with that was totally beyond his experience. He went to his father now and said, "What am I going to do?" And his father said, "Stay on this side of the boundary line till you get over it." Good enough advice, but if he didn't get over it? This question his father did not seem to want to answer, but he knew also that if his father had come up with a solution, he wouldn't have been interested. He turned again so that he was lying on his back, and tears of gratitude ran down his face, past his ears, through the stubble on his jaw, and were soaked up by the pillowcase which smelled of sunshine. The alarm clock went off and ran all the way down, and he didn't move. Sleep, when it finally came, had failed him. His wife shook him awake, and he was under the impression that he answered her, but all he did was sit up in bed and reach for the matches and light the lamp to dress by. Shaking the grates in the kitchen stove, he was aware suddenly of how cut off they now were from everybody, and committed to lying. There was nothing to be done about it. He didn't want to not love her. It was as simple as that. And with the lantern swinging from his hand, he went off into the darkness as on any other morning, as he did on the last morning of his life. Clarence and the hired man started to carry the full milk pails into the shed where the separator was, and when he didn't follow them, Clarence turned and said, "Aren't you coming?" "Not tonight," he said, only to have his excuses brushed aside. The memory of making love lay like a bandage across the front of his mind, day and night. He waited for her to tell him where they would meet and when, and marveled at excuses she thought up to get to him. No matter what the excuse was, it always worked. No excuse at all worked equally well. He thought, if Clarence comes in from the fields unexpectedly and she isn't there, and he doesn't wonder where she is or go out looking for us, which didn't prevent him from thinking also, we can't go on doing this to him. He doesn't deserve it. Pulling the bridle over the horse's nose, he wondered if they were already the talk of the neighborhood. I caught Cletus looking at us. What do you mean? As if we'd turned into strangers. You imagine it, she said, and kissed him. He found notes in his pocket that she had put there without his knowing it, and that Marie might have found when she went through his clothes on wash day. Were there others that he didn't discover in time? He waited for his wife to say something, and she didn't. He meant to warn Fern about the notes, and forgot. There was no limit to the falsehood and deception, the smiles he made himself smile, and even so he was caught off guard. Walking from the barn to the house, he felt Clarence's arm draped over his shoulder, and before he could stop himself, he moved away to avoid the physical contact. Also, to escape responding to it, which would have been to tell Clarence and get it over with. When it was too late, he wished he had. Chapter 7. Innocent, more or less, creatures. Lloyd is preoccupied. It was the first time Cletus had ever heard the word, and apparently it didn't mean what you might think. About what? His mother asked. I have no idea, his father said. She didn't for a minute believe him. His manner and his voice and the look in his eyes all betrayed him. He suspected them. Of how much there was no telling. Of something. Another man would have come out with it. As long as he went on pretending not to know, her hands were tied. Maybe that was his game. She watched him for 2 days. On the morning of the third, he asked if there was any more coffee, and she said accusingly, "You're not fooling me. I know that you know." When it turned out that she was mistaken, and he didn't know, there was no way she could take the words back. It was as if a hole opened suddenly at their feet, and they fell into it. Over the mirror in the barber shop, there's a colored poster, framed, of a woman with a pompadour. Her ample bust emerges from a water lily. She is holding an eyedropper elegantly and advocating murine for the eyes. On the opposite wall, a whole row of calendars for the year 1921. On the linoleum floor, swatches of straight, light brown hair. A minute before they were part of Cletus Smith. Now they are waiting for the broom. The wall clock says 17 minutes after 2. Tick-tock, tick-tock. And the odor of bay rum lingers on the air. Sitting in the barber chair with his head pushed down so that his chin is resting on his collarbone, Cletus can only look sidewise. He sees a shadow fall on the plate-glass window and then withdraw abruptly. With a wave of his clippers, the barber indicates the sidewalk empty now. "Wasn't that your friend?" The question is not directed at Cletus but at his father, waiting his turn under the row of calendars. When there is no answer, the barber is not offended. People either answered prying questions, in which case you found out something you didn't know before, or they ignored them, and if you bided your time, you found out the answer anyway. Friend no longer, he remarked to himself, and then his eyebrows rose because of what he saw in the mirror. The boy was blushing. Riding on the seat of the cultivator, in the field that lay next to the road, Lloyd Wilson did not raise his head when Clarence drove by in the buckboard wagon, with Cletus on the seat beside him. The two men met once, by accident, at the mailboxes, and after that they saw to it that they didn't meet anywhere. Though they were no longer on speaking terms, they couldn't avoid seeing each other at a distance in the fields. And at night, the lighted windows of one another's houses, once a comfort, only made them uneasy, since it was a reminder of all the things that were not the way they used to be. Fred Wilson finished reading the evening paper and took off his glasses in order to rub his eyes. The family resemblance was apparent for a moment. "Well, tomorrow's another day," he said, and stood up. "Sleep well, Uncle Fred," Marie Wilson said. "If I don't know whose fault it will be but mine," he said cheerfully, and went off to his room back of the kitchen. The children said good night to their mother and then to their father and went upstairs to bed. The clock ticked, loudly at times. A piece of wood collapsed in the stove. Lloyd Wilson was aware that the silence in the room was not of the ordinary kind, and braced himself. His wife rolled the socks she had just finished darning into a ball and said, "Has something happened between you and Clarence?" "No." "You haven't quarreled?" "No." "Then what is the matter?" "I don't know." "You mean you don't know how to tell me?" He didn't know how to lie. To other people, yes, but not to her. He said slowly, "I guess that's what I do mean." He saw that her face was flushed and her eyes bright with tears. If it's what I think it is, I don't want to hear about it. What happened was that I told you, I don't want to hear about it." Couldn't prevent it. "And that makes it more comfortable for both of you, I'm sure, but don't ask me to believe it too. From now on, you go your way and I'll go mine." What she meant by this statement he didn't know, and it didn't seem like a good time to ask. Their eyes met, and with an effort, he kept his glance from faltering. The accusing look and the missing front tooth were things he had not bargained for when he stood up before the minister. Or she either, he thought sadly. Days went by, and he had almost come to the conclusion she didn't mean anything by that statement, and that things had settled back into the way they were before, when she announced that she was going to take the children and move in with her sister in town. He said the first thing that came into his head, which was, "But you don't get on with her." "I know, but she says she'll take us in." Blood being thicker than water. He sat back and listened while she talked their whole married life out of existence. At no time did he argue with her or deny any statement she made. Finally, when there was nothing more to say, she picked up the lamp and went into the next room, and he followed her, and they undressed and got into bed as if nothing whatever had happened. After a while he said in the dark, "You can take the girls, but not the boys." There was no answer from the far side of the bed. He knew that even now he could persuade her to change her mind, but if he did... "I have never before in my life been happy," he said, "and I will not give it up." Because there wasn't room for everything in the buggy, they took with them only the baby's paraphernalia and what the rest of them needed for the night, and left the battered suitcases and an old leather trunk for him to bring the next day. Nobody spoke all the way into town. When he pulled on the reins, the little girls were ready, and one by one jumped for the metal step of the buggy. Hazel stood waiting for her mother to hand the baby down to her. "Be good girls," he called after them, but they were too frightened by what was happening to turn and smile at him. He waited until they had all disappeared into the house and then gave the whip a flick. He hadn't meant for things to go this far, and neither had he thought ahead to what might happen next. Coming back to the farm, his spirits lifted for no reason, or perhaps because a thing hanging over them for so long had at last happened, clearing the air. Fred never asked questions. The little boys couldn't understand why their mother wasn't there, and he didn't know what she might have said to them, so he told them to be quiet and eat their supper. In the night he heard Orville crying and got up and brought him into his own bed, where he dropped off instantly. But after that he let them cry themselves to sleep, hoping they'd get over it sooner. He tried to be both mother and father to them, which wasn't easy. When Saturday night came round, he placed the washtub in the middle of the kitchen floor and filled it with warm water from the stove, and they stood in it. He poured soapy water over their thin shoulders, as he had seen their mother do, and examined their ears for dirt, but his hands were not as gentle or as practiced as hers, and Dean looked at him accusingly and said, "You hurt me." "Do it yourself, then," he said. But he was damned if he was going to let them grow up in town, not knowing how to handle an axe or plow a straight furrow He heard about a widow woman over toward Harmon Springs who was living with relatives and depended on them for her keep. She might be a little too old for the work, but if he got somebody younger, people would talk. "I'll have to think about it," she said when he told her why he had come. She didn't have to think about it very long. As he was getting back into the buggy, the front door flew open and she called out to him to wait while she gathered together a few garments. Settling herself on the seat beside him, she said, "Just call me Mrs. B. Everybody does." She meant everybody in Harmon Springs. What with cataracts in both eyes and dizzy spells that came over her if she got down on her knees and poked with the broom in dark corners, the widow didn't do a great deal about the dust that blew into the house from the plowed fields, or notice that the pots and pans had acquired a coating of grease. She loved to stand and talk, and one listener was as good as another. "Stop me if I've told you this before. I don't want to repeat myself," she said. But there was no stopping her, or even getting a word in edgewise. Though she was grateful not to be living on the charity of cousins once removed, who raised their eyebrows if she asked for a second helping of chicken and gravy, still the days were long, and she wished that people would drop in more. To some she might appear just an ordinary farm woman, but her family had supplied the state of Tennessee with a congressman and a judge. "Well, ma'am, I know you must be right proud of them," Lloyd Wilson said on his way out the door. It was more than she could do to keep track of his coming and going. Just when she thought he was going to settle down at last and she could dispose of the things she'd been saving up to tell him, he put his jacket on and left the house. To do what, since it was dark outside and the chores were done, she couldn't imagine. "Shaw," she said to the little boys as she went after them with a wash rag. "If you expect to grow up a big, strong man like your father, you can't object to a little soap." It is not a crime to ask questions, especially indirect ones, and from Fred Wilson's reluctant answers, the widow had no difficulty in putting two and two together. She also questioned the little boys about their mother, and said primly, "I hope I shall have the pleasure of meeting her some day." They did not like her very much, but at least she was a woman. She wore skirts, and so they leaned against her sometimes out of habit or when they missed their mother. They were very good about coming when she called, and the rest of the time they wandered around together as if they were afraid of being separated. Riding past on his bicycle, Cletus was conscious of the fact that Mrs. Wilson wasn't there, only that old woman. No more slices of bread that was still warm from the oven. If he saw the little boys or Mr. Wilson, he stopped to talk to them. Mr. Wilson acted as though everything was just the same. "Cletus," he said, "you're looking very spry this morning. Do you think we're in for some more rain?" But it wasn't the same, if he never came to their house anymore, the way he used to. And the Wilson girls weren't going to be at school to see him graduate from 7th grade. Wayne had a basket of toys that he kept at Aunt Jenny's house. But instead of playing with them, he followed her around all morning, talking her leg off. About what, she had only a vague idea, for she was only half listening. Finally her patience gave way, and she said, "Wayne, honey, be quiet a moment. I can't hear myself think." And from the way he stood there, looking at her, she realized that he understood perfectly that she was half sick about what was happening out in the country, and why his mother was unable to give him her undivided attention the way she used to. "Not that it matters whether I do or don't hear myself think. You must forgive me, dear heart. I'm not responsible this morning. Now then." And she sat down in a rocking chair and gathered him on her lap, and he put his head on her shoulder, and they rocked. After a while he said, "Aunt Jenny, what happens if people wake up after they're buried and can't get out?" "That couldn't happen. They're already in heaven. And on the resurrection day their bodies and their souls are joined, and they live happy ever after." Looking at him, she could tell that he partly believed what she said and partly didn't believe it, having seen the crows picking at the carcasses of dead animals. When his mother came to get him, he gathered up his things and stood there waiting, but she said, "Run outside and play. Aunt Jenny and I have things to talk about." The fairgrounds were deserted. The circus had gone 10 days before, and it was too soon for the county fair. There was nothing to look at, and nobody to talk to. When he got tired of waiting on the front steps, he went back into the house, and his mother made him go outdoors again. It will wear itself out, Clarence said to himself, provided he was patient and didn't drive Fern to do something foolish. He was patient, up to a point. For him, he was very patient. But she knew just where he drew the line, and daring him, stepped over it. When he lost his temper, he did things he could hardly believe afterward. Once, when they were having an argument, she screamed, and Victor picked up a bucket of water and threw it over him. The shock brought him to his senses. He looked down and saw he had the poker in his hand. What she did deliberately, and she never said she was sorry. Somebody turned the wick of the lamp up too high, and it made a fine layer of soot over everything. He expected her to burst into tears and start taking down the front room curtains. Instead, she laughed. He asked her to go with him to see his parents, and she refused. "But if you don't come, they'll think we aren't getting along," which is only the truth. "They've had enough trouble in their lives. I don't want to add to it." "You won't be," she said. "They know. Everybody knows. That's all people have to think about." Since there was work to be done outside, he gave up and reached for his jacket. All his socks had holes in them. The strawberry bed was loaded with fruit, and she didn't bother to pick it. She left the beans on the vines until they were too big to eat. He no longer had a wife, only a prisoner. Unwatered too long, the Christmas cactus in the front window died and ended up on the rubbish pile. When it was time for her plate of scraps, the dog came and wolfed them down and then withdrew into her house. The cats followed Fern Smith around, purring as usual, and with their tails straight up in the air. Since they were neither faithful nor obedient themselves, they saw no reason why women should be. The widow knew that if she talked long enough at Fred Wilson, he would have to lower the newspaper that hid his face and listen to her, whether he wanted to or not. He heard about the habits of her late husband and the hard life they'd had, so much sickness and losing the farm because they couldn't keep up payments on the mortgage. The younger son, her favorite, dead of a ruptured appendix. The older one, who seldom came to see her because his wife made trouble if he did. And the daughter who lived too far away and never wrote except once in a great while to say that things were not going well with them. In exchange for all this information which he did not particularly want, Fred Wilson felt obliged to tell her something. So he told her about his wife's lingering illness. "Poor thing," she said sympathetically. "But she's better off now. She's out of it at last." When he said how grateful he was to his nephew for taking him in after she died, the widow said, "But wouldn't you be happier in your own home?" "I love my wife too much ever to remarry," he said firmly. He might not be able to read everybody's mind, but he had no trouble reading hers. The widow had other strings to her bow. One day she met Colonel Dowling in the Smith's Lane, and he bowed to her, and she never got over it. The social life that went on in her mind was vivid and kept her from being lonely. When Colonel Dowling said, "Mrs. B., would you care to take a spin in my car?" she said, "No, thank you," or, "Well, since you insist," depending on her mood. At Aunt Jenny's house, in a dresser drawer crammed with odds and ends of female clutter, there is an oval picture of her at the age of 23. Every other picture of herself she has destroyed. She was never a beautiful woman, but neither was she as plain as she imagined. When this picture was taken, she was head over heels in love with Tom Evans. But for some reason, love, even of the most ardent and soul-destroying kind, is never caught by the lens of the camera. One would almost think it didn't exist. Downstairs, on a bracket shelf, next to a vase with hand-painted pink roses on it, there is a matching picture of him, taken at the same time. His hair is roached, and he is wearing a high, stiff collar, and hardly anything shows in his face but his Welsh ancestry. His father and mother were rabid Methodists, but the rigid attitudes that they tried to hand down to him did not stand the test of experience, and he ended up not believing in God. "I believe in paying your bills on time," he said when he wanted to excite the pious, and in common politeness. He worked hard because he liked to work, and was thrifty because he enjoyed that also. He worked for somebody else not because he had an ordinary mind, but because the town wouldn't support a second plumbing business. Occasionally he treated himself to a glass of beer, but the swinging doors of a saloon did not have an irresistible attraction for him. His fastidiousness could be explained easily enough by assuming that a nobleman's child and a commoner's had been switched in their cradles. But in Logan County there are no castles for the baby to be carried from in the middle of the night, and in fact no nobleman, so there must have been some other explanation. He died in agony of a gallbladder attack when he was in his early 50s, and the oval photograph, adapting itself to circumstances, is now clearly the photograph of a dead man. He could not have loved Fern more if she had been his own daughter. To an outsider, it seemed that Aunt Jenny was relegated to the position of waiting on them. Waiting on them was her whole pleasure, and she did not ask herself whether they valued her sufficiently, or at all. Innocence is defined in dictionaries as freedom from guilt or sin, especially through lack of knowledge, purity of heart, blamelessness, guilelessness, artlessness, simplicity, etc. There is no aspect of the word that does not apply to her. Without the heavy-set, aristocratic man snoring away on his side of the bed, without the fresh-eyed child whose hair ribbon needs retying, without the conversation at meals and the hearty appetites and getting dressed for church on time, without the tears of laughter and the worry about making both ends meet, the unpaid bills, the layoffs, both seasonal and unexpected, without the toys that have to be picked up lest somebody trip over them, and the 7 shirts that have to be washed and ironed, one for every day of the week, without the scraped knee and the hurt feelings, the misunderstandings that need to be cleared up, the voices calling for her so that she is perpetually having to stop what she's doing and go see what they want. Without all this, what have you? A mystery. How is it she didn't realize it was going to last such a short time? When Lloyd Wilson got upset at the thought of the money that used to be in his savings account in the Lincoln National Bank and wasn't there any longer, he reminded himself that he had a chance to object to the amount of the settlement and just said, "Where do I sign?" She had cleaned him out, but he owed her something, and he couldn't let his children starve. It didn't occur to him, though, that she would turn the little girls against him. They sat with their mother in church all in a row, and if he tried to catch their eye or smiled at them, they looked straight ahead at nothing. When they were older, they would feel different maybe, but all the same it hurt his feelings. He changed his life insurance policies so that the boys were the sole beneficiaries. Mrs. Stroud drove out to her farm earlier in the day to avoid the heat. While they were inspecting the corn cribs, she said crossly, "Your marital difficulties do not interest me, but I don't like to see this place going to rack and ruin because of them. The woman you have hired to keep house for you is old and half blind, and the house is by no means the way your wife kept it." "I know," he said, for once neither evasive nor verging on insolence. "My house in town is always clean, and I see no reason why this house, which, after all, is mine too, shouldn't be the same way. I'll speak to her," he said soberly, but he didn't. As though he were gifted with second sight, he regarded the arrangement as temporary. As Cletus walked into the cool shade of the house, he heard voices. His mother's voice, and then Aunt Jenny's. He knew the cookie jar was empty, but he put his hand in it anyway, hoping to be surprised. And as he felt around inside, his mother said, "That was last Saturday. Naturally, I was nervous, but it turned out there was no cause to be." She waited until he had gone upstairs to his room before she continued. "When I got home, I said to you-know-who, I said, 'It may interest you to know that I've consulted a lawyer.' I decided the time had come to tell him. "I don't know as I'd have done that," Aunt Jenny said. "That is, not if you're meaning to avoid trouble." Fern Smith wasn't meaning to avoid trouble. She was bent on making it. It was her only hope. It set him back on his heels. I knew it would. Aunt Jenny raised her eyes to indicate the ventilator in the ceiling. "If we don't mention any names, how can Cletus tell who we're talking about? And I haven't mentioned any." "What did he say? Clarence?" "No, the man in town. He listened and asked questions, and finally he said, 'Mrs. Smith, I think we can safely say we have a case.'" "A case of what?" Cletus wondered. With Lord Wilson's wife gone, what prevented her from throwing a shawl over her shoulders and running across the fields to his house? The whole community. It was one thing to behave in such a way as to provoke gossip, and quite another for them to live in open immorality. They had talked about it often. She didn't care if every woman she knew stopped speaking to her, but they wouldn't let their husbands have anything to do with him, and that might make it very difficult. There wasn't a man for miles around who wasn't indebted to him for something, but the only one who ever seemed to feel this was Clarence. And Mrs. Stroud. He didn't know. With her, anything was possible. When she came out to the farm these days, she had a cat-and-mouse expression on her face that was new, as if she was enjoying the situation he'd got himself into, and was watching with amusement to see what he would do next. People will stand only so much, and there is a line that you can't cross over no matter how much you would like to. If he did cross over it, and he got a letter informing him that after the 1st of March Mrs. Stroud had no further need for his services, where would they go then? Who would take him on as a tenant when they found out that he was living with a woman who was not his wife? Their courage failed them. Clarence believed Fern when she said that she had neither seen Lloyd nor talked to him. but he knew in his bones that they communicated with each other somehow. He questioned the boys and searched in odd corners about the farm, a hollow tree, an abandoned chicken house, a shed that was far enough from the house so that Lloyd could have gone there at night without the risk of being seen. But the dogs would have barked, and the boys clearly knew nothing. About that, anyway. How much else they knew, he didn't like to think. One minute she was careful and talked in a low voice, or she would get up and shut the door. And then suddenly it didn't matter to her anymore what she said or who heard her. Standing at the head of the stairs in her nightgown, she shouted down at him, "You treat the horses better than you treat me." It wasn't true, and she knew it. She said she'd been in love with somebody else when she married him. He didn't know whether to believe her or not. It might be something she made up on the spur of the moment to knock the wind out of him. He drove into town and got drunk and came home and climbed on top of her. It didn't work. She fought like a wildcat, and he fell off the bed and lay tangled up in the bedclothes. In a sudden weariness of soul, he dropped off to sleep and woke in broad daylight with a hangover and a foul taste in his mouth. The bed was empty. He went to see the Baptist minister, and they had a long talk. In the minister's study, with the door closed. Some things he could hardly bring himself to say, but he felt better after he'd said them, and the expression on the minister's face was sympathetic when he said, "Why don't we kneel down right now and ask for God's help?" So they did, and he wasn't embarrassed. At that point, he would have done anything. Standing by the front door, with the rain blowing in their faces, the minister said, "Tell her to come and see me. It may be that I can show her where the path of duty lies." Fern Smith didn't go to see him. Instead, she went to town, to the little house across from the fairgrounds. When Aunt Jenny's opinion didn't conform to hers, it could be brushed aside. The widow could not let a farm wagon pass by without running to the front window to see who was in the wagon. It wasn't likely, therefore, that she would fail to notice that her employer had something on his mind. Poor man, he missed his family and was regretting the way he'd behaved. She intended to try and make him understand, she was just waiting for the auspicious moment, that he mustn't be afraid his wife wouldn't forgive him. If he went to her in the right spirit and told her how sorry he was, things were bound to work out the way he wanted them to. And when his wife did forgive him and came home, then she might be glad of a little help with the housework. And if not, bravely Mrs. B decided she was not going to let selfish considerations stand in the way of Lloyd's happiness. When Cletus walked into the cow barn, the cats ran to greet him. His father was already there, milking Flossie. Victor should have been milking the cow on the other side of him, but he had gone off on a bender even though it wasn't a national holiday. Cletus picked up a milk bucket and stool and sat down. He tried to adjust the rhythm of his squirt-squirt to his father's. Old Bess moved her feet restlessly, and he said, "So, boss." The cats rubbed against his ankles, purring, but he didn't feel them. The night before, the terrible voice had given him something new to worry about. I can walk out of this house any time I feel like it, taking the boys with me. He fell back into the same deep sleep, as if nothing had happened. But this morning, while he was mooning over his cereal, there it was. He saw that Blackie was sitting with his pink mouth stretched wide open, and he squirted a stream of milk into it. 16 years old that cat was, and his ears all cut up from fighting, and hardly a tooth in his head. She won't do it, Cletus thought. But why shouldn't she? What was there to stop her, except fear of his father? And she wasn't afraid of anything or anybody. The level of milk rose in the two pails. His father whistled the same sad tune he whistled all day long. When he stood up, Cletus said, "Last night I heard something." Outside? No. Shouldn't listen to conversations that don't concern you. I wasn't trying to listen. I see. Well, what did you hear? Mama said... She said she might move into town and take me and Wayne with her. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Pa? Yes, son. Promise me you won't get sore if I say something? He waited, and there was no answer from the next stall. Please don't argue with her about it, Pa. Why not? Do you want to move into town with her? You know I don't. But you shouldn't have said you wouldn't let her do it. If you tell her she can't do something, then she has to do it. Why, you little fucker. The heavy hand shot out and sent him sprawling. What the boy had said was true, but a lot of difference that made. The bucket was overturned. A pool of milk began to spread along the barn floor. With his right ear roaring with pain and one whole side of his face gone numb, he picked himself up and drew the stool out from between the cow's legs and put the bucket under her. He managed not to cry, but his hands shook, and the milk squirted unevenly into the pail. The next time you try to tell me how to run my affairs, it won't be just a cloud on the head. I'll break your goddamn back. That's said. He picked up his stool and moved on to the adjoining stall, and sat down, and with his head pressed against the cow's side, resumed his sad whistling. The conversation didn't turn out the way the widow expected. She thought Lloyd Wilson would open his heart to her, and instead he said, "Yes, well, I'll think about it," and picked up the farmer's almanac. She paused in her crocheting and pushed the lamp closer to him. Either he didn't want to talk about it, or he had something else on his mind that he couldn't bring himself to discuss with her, maybe money troubles. Or it could be that Mrs. Stroud was making difficulty. She was not a very nice woman, and had her nose into everything. Chapter 8, The Machinery of Justice. Clarence was fastening the pasture gate with a loop of wire when it came over him that she was gone. He broke into a run. In his mind, he saw the note propped against the sugar bowl on the kitchen table. When he flung the door open, she was standing at the stove, her hair damp with steam, stirring the clothes in the big copper boiler. They stared at each other a moment, and then she said, "No, I'm still here." When she did leave 6 weeks later, he had no premonition of it. He was informed through the mail by her lawyer that any attempt to get in touch with her or with their children, except through him, could be considered as constituting harassment. and that whatever steps were necessary to protect her from it would be taken. The next thing that happened was a notice from the county clerk's office. She was suing him for a divorce. Shortly thereafter, Fern Smith sat in her lawyer's office, discussing a notice she had received from Clarence's lawyer. It was out of their hands now. They had stopped shouting at each other and put their faith in legal counsel, with the result that how things could be made to look was what counted, not how they actually were. The divorce proceedings and the cross bill were tried as a single case in the fall term of court. In the jury box and in the visitors' part of the courtroom were men Clarence Smith knew, and diverting his eyes from them, he had to sit and hear his most intimate life laid bare. He did not recognize the description of himself, and he wondered how Fern's lawyer could utter with such a ring of sincerity statements he must know had no foundation in truth, or how she could sit there looking like a victim when it was she who had made it all come about. Her lawyer had found half a dozen witnesses who were pleased to testify to his bad temper, which surprised him. He had not known that he had any enemies. He had only one witness for his side, but he was counting on that one witness to establish the falsehood of everything that was said. All but unrecognizable in a new suit and shaved by the barber, the hired man testified to intimacies. He used other words that had been put in his mouth by Clarence's lawyer. On various occasions, he said, he had come upon the plaintiff and Wilson in an embrace or kissing, or with his hand inside her blouse. When his employer was off the property, Wilson would come to the house, and the shade in the upstairs bedroom would be drawn, and it would be an hour or more sometimes before he reappeared. Pacing back and forth in front of the jury box, Fern Smith's lawyer spoke eloquently of the close ties that bound the two households together, and in particular of the friendship of the two men. Was it not a fact, was it not an incontrovertible fact, that over a period of many years before the present discord arose, and with Clarence Smith's full knowledge and approval, Lloyd Wilson had frequently gone to the Smiths' house when Smith was off the premises? Before proceeding with the cross-examination, he would like to offer, as evidence bearing on the reliability of the witness's testimony, the fact that he was seldom without the smell of liquor on his breath, and that he had spent the night of July 4th in jail in an inebriated condition. Clarence's lawyer leapt to his feet and exclaimed, "Your Honor, I object." And the judge said sourly, "Objection overruled." Victor was easily trapped into saying things he did not mean, and that could not be true. And his confusion was such that the courtroom was moved to laughter again and again. After that, Clarence was called to the witness stand and placed under oath, and heard acts of his described that he could not truthfully deny. What Fern's lawyer did not tell the gentlemen of the jury was the provocation that had led up to this violent behavior. And when Clarence tried to, he was instructed by the judge to confine his remarks to answering the questions put to him by counsel. Nobody said in court that Clarence Smith was pierced to the heart by his wife's failure to love him, and it wouldn't have made any difference if they had. The evening paper reported that Mrs. Fern Smith was granted a decree of divorce against her husband on the grounds of extreme and repeated cruelty, the charges in his cross bill not being substantiated in the eyes of the jury. He was ordered to pay $50 a month alimony, and she was granted custody of the children. The ringing of the locusts wore itself out and stopped, only to start up again in the treetops. with Aunt Jenny standing over him, telling him what to do next. Cletus carried load after load of junk up the outside cellar stairs and on out to the alley. Cans of long-dried paint and varnish, jars of preserve that had gone bad or were too old to be trusted, empty medicine bottles, bundles of old magazines and newspapers, an iron bedstead, a chair with a cane seat that had given way, a sheet iron stove with one leg missing, a 10-gallon milk can with a hole in the bottom, screens so eaten with rust that you could put your finger through them. Occasionally, she would decide that something, a bamboo picture frame with its glass broken, or a silk dress that was stained under the arms, was too good to throw away, and it was put aside until she could recollect somebody who would be glad to have it. Going through a box of old letters, she came upon a canceled bank book and turned the pages thoughtfully. "I have a little money," she remarked. Why did she say that? It was the one thing she meant to tell nobody. Tom had a life insurance policy that was all paid up when he died. I may not be in the same class with John D. Rockefeller, but you'd find that $5,000 was a lot of money if you tried to save it. It'll go to your mother when I die. I just want you to know how things are. Which wasn't exactly the truth. What she really wanted was for him to say something, to be surprised by this cat she had inadvertently let out of the bag. "I mean you won't starve," she said. It took both of them to carry the horsehair mattress spotted with mildew. As they were coming back from the alley, she said, "That's enough for today. There's a storeroom that needs cleaning out, but it can wait." He closed the cellar door. She gave him the padlock, which had been in her apron pocket, and they went into the house by way of the back porch. She wanted to say, "I don't like the way things have turned out any better than you do," and was afraid to say it, lest Cletus think she wasn't glad to have them under her roof. She made him wash his hands at the kitchen sink and gave him a glass of cold milk and a large piece of gooseberry pie. Leaning against the sink, he took a swallow of milk and then said, "When Victor and Pa come in from the fields, who gets their meals?" "Nobody, so far as I know. It isn't easy for them, I'm sure, but any man knows how to fry bacon and eggs and make coffee. They're used to eating more than that. He may have to get somebody to keep house for him like Mr. Wilson," she said, and could have bit her tongue out. "You'll have Sunday dinner with us, won't you?" his mother said. "Come right from church, so we can have a good visit." There was no way Clarence could say no, or he would have. He didn't tell her that he had stopped going to church. When they sat down to the table, he saw that his mother had cooked all his favorite dishes, and he tried to eat, though he had no appetite. From his father's uneasiness, and from the careful absence of any expression on her face, he knew that her feelings were hurt. She had expected him to tell them everything he couldn't tell the judge and the jury, and when he didn't, she thought it was because he didn't trust them. "We've been expecting the boys to pay us a visit," she said, "but so far they haven't. I dare say Fern won't allow it." "I don't imagine she would do that," he said, avoiding her glance. His mother and father were the only two people on earth he trusted at this point, but where to begin? With the fact that he was having trouble scraping together the money to pay his ex-wife's alimony. There wasn't anything he could tell them that wouldn't make them grieve, and anyway, he couldn't bear to talk about it. He knew what had been done to him, but not what he had done to deserve it. It would have been a help, if at some time some Baptist preacher, resting his forearms on the pulpit and hunching his shoulders, had said, "People neither get what they deserve nor deserve what they get. The gentle and the trusting are trampled on. The rich man usually forces his way through the eye of the needle, and there is little or no point in putting your faith in divine providence." On the other hand, how could any preacher, Baptist or otherwise, say this? Fern was advised by her attorney that it would be better if she and Lloyd Wilson didn't see each other for a time. When they wrote to each other, they were careful to post the letters themselves. Her letters were very long, his short. It was not natural to him to put his feelings on paper. But as she read and reread his letters, the words that were not there were put there by her imagination, until she was satisfied that he really did love her as much as she loved him. The dog waited every afternoon by the mailbox. She knew when it was time to round up the cows, but the boy might come and not find her there. So she went on waiting, and when she saw the man coming toward her, she ran off into a cornfield, but only a little ways. She didn't really try to escape the beating she knew he was going to give her. Cletus started to ride out to the farm on his bicycle, and his mother said, "Where are you going?" And he told her, and she said, "I'd rather you didn't." When he asked her why not, she looked unhappy and said, "Please don't argue with me, Cletus. If your father wants to see you, he'll say so." It was only a hairline hesitation that kept her from telling him everything. Eventually, when he was grown, she would sit down with him some day and tell him the whole story from the beginning, and he would appreciate all she had been through and forgive her. "Your father wouldn't give me my freedom," she would say, "and so I had to go to court and get it that way." In these imaginary conversations, it did not occur to her that he might not forgive her. "If Lloyd hadn't been in love with me," she imagined herself saying, "or if he had loved his wife, I guess I would have gone on being married to your father, ill-suited to each other though we were." At the memory of Lloyd Wilson's hands resting on her shoulders as he bent down and kissed her, she shuddered with happiness. By staring at her fixedly, Wayne made the acquaintance of a little girl named Patsy, who lived 4 or 5 houses down the street from Aunt Jenny's house. She had a tricycle, which they rode up and down the cement sidewalk, and only now and then did they quarrel about whose turn it was. He went to Patsy's house early in the morning, and when lunchtime came and Patsy's mother asked him if he would like to stay and eat with them, he always said yes. When she said, "Don't you think it would be a good idea if you ran home and told your mother?" he said, "She won't mind." Patsy's mother thought it would be nice if Wayne's mother said, "Thank you for being so nice to my little boy," or something of that kind, instead of not even bothering to look up when she was passing the house, and her name in the paper and all. In a town the size of Lincoln, there are no well-kept secrets. Somebody told somebody who told somebody who told somebody who told Clarence about the fat letters with no return address that Fern dropped in a big green box in front of the post office after dark. It didn't even take very long for this to happen, or for Fern to find out that Clarence knew. Only now, after the long battle had been won, did she become frightened. She found herself thinking for the first time about Clarence. about what she had done to him and what he might be capable of. She hadn't wanted to take the $50 a month alimony. It was the lawyer's idea. She found herself reliving the moment when Clarence picked up the poker and started for her, and other moments like it. The dog came racing down the lane and threw herself upon Cletus, and he let the bicycle fall and buried his face in her fur. But after that, nothing was the way he thought it would be. He had expected to follow his father around, helping him with whatever he was doing, and instead they sat in the house all afternoon, trying to think of things to say. "Thou shalt not bear false witness," the Bible said. But why not? If the jury couldn't tell the difference between the truth and a pack of lies, and neither could the judge. Dressed in black and wearing a veil as if she was in mourning for him, dabbing her eyes with her handkerchief, she fooled them all. The Bible also said, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife," and he was ordered to pay them $50 a month. That was their reward for breaking the 10 Commandments. How was he to explain this to a half-grown boy? Also, he was ashamed and embarrassed at all his son had been put through. He knew that Cletus would have preferred to stay out here with him, and he couldn't even manage that. As a result of that humiliating day in court, Clarence Smith's sense of cause and effect suffered a permanent distortion. His mind was filled with thoughts that, taken one by one, were perfectly reasonable, but in sequence did not quite make sense. He had no idea how long some of his silences were. At last the hands of the clock allowed him to say, "It's time you were starting back to town." "Can't I stay and help with the milking?" "We don't want to be on the road on a bicycle after dark." "I could get out of the way if a car comes." "You better go now. Your mother will worry about you." He waved goodbye to his father, who was standing on the porch steps, and kicked the standard of his bicycle up into the catch at the rear mudguard, and said, "No, Trixie, don't look at me like that. You can't go with me. No. No, do you hear? No!" On the following Saturday he asked his mother if he could ride out to the farm, and again she said, "I'd rather you didn't." She couldn't bear to tell him that his father had sent word by a neighbor that she was not to let him come any more. Whether they are a part of home or home is a part of them is not a question children are prepared to answer. Having taken away the dog, take away the kitchen, the smell of something good in the oven for dinner, also the smell of wash day, of wool drying on the wooden rack, of ashes, of soup simmering on the stove. Take away the patient old horse waiting by the pasture fence. Take away the chores that kept him busy from the time he got home from school until they sat down to supper. Take away the early morning mist, the sound of crows quarreling in the treetops. His work clothes are still hanging on a nail beside the door of his room, but nobody puts them on or takes them off. Nobody sleeps in his bed or reads the broken-back copy of Tom Swift and his flying machine. Take that away, too, while you're at it. Take away the pitcher and bowl, both of them dry and dusty. Take away the cow barn, where the cats, sitting all in a row, wait with their mouths wide open for somebody to squirt milk down their throats. Take away the horse barn, too, the smell of hay and dust and horse piss and old sweat-stained leather, and the rain beating down on the plowed field beyond the open door. Take all this away, and what have you done to him? In the face of a deprivation so great, what is the use of asking him to go on being the boy he was? He might as well start life over again, as some other boy instead. Just when she had about given up hoping, the widow met Lloyd Wilson's wife and was much taken with her. Fingering a list of things that only she knew where to put her hands on, in chests and dresser drawers and cardboard boxes pushed back under the eaves in the attic, Marie Wilson made polite conversation. She could hardly believe the disorder and filth that met her eyes everywhere she looked. The windows were so thickly coated with dust and cobwebs you could hardly see out of them. The table runner on the parlor table had ink stains on it, and somebody had burned a hole in the big rag rug that it had taken her all one winter to make. She knew without having to look that no broom ever went searching for lint under the beds. The place hadn't been aired for weeks, and the whole house, but especially the downstairs bedroom, stank of kerosene and sweaty clothing and stale human breath. Clapping her hands together, she caught a clothes moth. What the widow was waiting for, as she talked on and on, was a sign that the approval was reciprocated. Sitting on the edge of her chair, Marie Wilson said, "That's quite true, and I know what you mean, and I'm sure you're right." And finally, reaching the end of her patience, she said, "I'm afraid you'll have to excuse me, but I have things to do." Still talking, the widow followed her up the attic stairs. But it was the little boys that upset her most. They were thin and pale, and answered her questions listlessly, as if they were addressing a stranger. She said, "You know that your father wouldn't let me take you with me." And they nodded. She brushed the hair out of their eyes and kissed them, and touched them on the cheek and on the shoulder as she talked to them, and the strangeness wore off eventually. After that, they wouldn't let her out of their sight. As she bent down to say goodbye to them, they both started to cry. Lloyd had driven into town to get her, and when she had gathered up what she wanted, he drove her back. She did not criticize the widow's housekeeping. It was his business, who he got to look after him. They had sat in an uncomfortable silence all the way out to the farm, but now he began to talk about the possibility of his finding a place somewhere in Iowa, which would mean that she would never see the boys at all. She asked him to bring them into town now and then to spend the night with her, and he answered, it would only make it worse for them. After which they both relapsed into silence. He could feel that there was something on the tip of her tongue which for some reason she kept deciding not to say. When he stopped in front of the boarding house where she was now living, she started to get out of the buggy and then turned to him and said, "I know you don't care in the least about me or your daughters, but I don't see how you could do that to Clarence." He looked down at his hands with the reins looped through his fingers and didn't answer. It rained and rained, and when the sky cleared, there was a light frost. The leaves started falling, and the dog could see stars shining in the tops of the trees. Having run away and been whipped for it until she could hardly stand, she stayed on the property. If she went looking for the boy, it was never farther than the foot of the lane. Sometimes Clarence forgot to feed her, and she had to remind him. What he put in her pan was not at all like the scraps the woman used to give her. The lawyer who had presented Clarence's case in court so badly sent him a much larger bill than he had expected. Though there was plenty of work that needed doing outside, he sat in the house brooding. The dog came and stood looking at him through the screen door, and he burst out at her in a rage, and she crept away. Lloyd Wilson went to see his wife and asked her once more to divorce him so that he and Fern could marry. She listened to what he had to say and then replied that she would think about it. From her tone of voice, he knew what her answer would be. She was not going to divorce him, and he had no grounds for divorcing her. Her eyelids were closed, but Fern wasn't asleep. She knew that she slept sometimes because she passed in and out of dreaming. Daybreak was a comfort. The birds, a rooster crowing. It meant that time existed. At night, everything stood still. The milkman clinking his bottles. People went about their rounds. Things happened that had nothing to do with her divorce. This she needed to be reminded of. It would have been a further comfort to get up and go downstairs and make a pot of coffee. But then she would wake Aunt Jenny in the front room. Sometimes she dozed. When she let go completely, it was always with a jerk that shook the bed and brought her wide awake. As if she were watching a play, she relived the time Tom locked her in her room. How old was she? 18? 19? "You're too young to know your own mind," he said. On the other hand, she wasn't too young to have fallen in love with a man with a wife and 2 children. "I won't have you breaking up somebody's home," he shouted. And she said, even as the words came out of her mouth, she regretted them. She said, "You're not my father, and I won't have you or anybody else telling me what I can or can't do." So he locked her in her room, and she climbed out the window onto the roof of the back porch and slid down the drain pipe. He knew what was happening, but didn't stir from his chair. When she got home, he was still sitting there, and they had it out at 2 o'clock in the morning. Whether she would have accepted Clarence if she hadn't been sick with love for a man she couldn't have was a question she had never until now tried to answer. At all events, when Clarence turned up and began courting her, there wasn't any shouting. Tom was polite to him, but distant, and he said nothing whatever to her. He didn't need to. She knew that he prided himself on his ability to maneuver people around to the position he wanted them to take, and usually he was successful, but not this time. Not with her. She came to the table with her face set, and the 2 of them ate in silence, unless Aunt Jenny said something, and even then they didn't always bother to answer. When she burst out, "What is it you have against him?" He wiped his mouth with his napkin and leaned back in his chair and looked at her. Then he said, "Are you sure you want to hear it?" And she said, "Yes." Perhaps at another time in her life she might have listened to him, and have considered the fact that nobody had ever understood her the way he did. But in the reckless mood she was in, it was his very understanding that drove her to act. She had to prove to him that he could be wrong too, that things were not necessarily always the way he thought. At one point she interrupted him, and he said, "Just let me finish. When you are picking a husband, there are only 2 things that count: good blood and a good disposition." One day on the courthouse square, before ever he turned up here, I saw him taking something out on his horses. I didn't enjoy it, and you wouldn't have either. He sat looking at her for a moment, and then he said, I see I might as well have been addressing a fence post. Try to understand that other people are real and have feelings too. And some things, once they're done, can't be undone. And he got up and left the table. When she announced that she and Clarence were going to be married and live on a farm in McLean County, he said, "Very well, but don't expect me to give you my blessing or come to the wedding." The wild geese were flying south. The nights turned cold. They finished shucking the corn. And one day Victor and Clarence came out of the house and stood together talking. Victor was wearing the new suit, and he had an old leather satchel with him. Since Clarence had been cleaned out by the lawsuit and couldn't afford to pay him anything, he had offered to work for his keep. The offer was not accepted. "I hope everything goes all right with you," he said now, shading his eyes from the direct light of the sun. "I'll manage somehow, I guess," Clarence said, and they shook hands. "You can always reach me through my sister in New Holland." Victor picked up the satchel and started off down the lane, and that was the last the dog ever saw of him. It turned warm again, and there was a week of fine weather. Except for the oak trees, all the leaves had fallen. Otherwise it was like summer. With her paws resting on her nose, the dog followed the circling of a big horsefly, and when it zoomed off, she closed her eyes and went to sleep, and dreamed that she was chasing a rabbit. Instead of getting on a train and going to Iowa to look for good land, Lloyd Wilson temporized. He told himself he couldn't leave before the 1st of November. And then it was November, and the days went by, and there was always something that needed doing. And with one excuse and another, he kept himself from facing the fact that what he was proposing to do was impossible. He had spent his whole life on this place, and leave it he could not. Even though the things people were saying about Clarence made it sound like he was more than half crazy and capable of anything. "You haven't given me much notice," Colonel Dowling said, "and I don't know that I can find somebody overnight." He noticed that Clarence put his finger inside his collar as if it were choking him, and that his hands were restless, and he stuttered. None of this was at all like him. But he was prepared to give his tenant a satisfactory character as far as it went. An unqualified recommendation wouldn't have been right in the circumstances. He just wasn't the man he used to be before he dragged his wife into court and all that. But it ought to be possible to say something sufficiently commendatory so that Clarence could still manage to find a place. The praise shouldn't be of so specific a kind that, if there was trouble later on, the people that took him on as their tenant would feel that he, the colonel, had been less than candid. One way or another, he would work it out. He was at his best with ambiguities of this kind. To his surprise, Clarence didn't ask for any recommendation. Instead, he shook hands and walked down the rickety wooden stairs and out onto the sidewalk, where he stood blinking in the harsh sunlight. He now had no wife, no family, and no farm, all through Lloyd Wilson's doing. It snowed, and then there were 3 or 4 days of soft weather, leaving the ground bare again. But after that, the nights were very cold. It was the time of year when the man usually sawed up fallen trees and split the logs and filled the woodshed with firewood. The dog took note of the fact that he didn't do any of these things. The woods were alive with quail and pheasant, and he didn't go hunting. The new tenant turned up with an acquaintance, a bald-headed older man, whom he kept turning to for his opinion. They went through the house with Clarence, and then they walked around outside, inspecting the barns and the outbuildings and asking a great many questions about yield and acreage. At one point, all three men turned to look at the dog, and it didn't take any great intelligence on her part to know who it was they were discussing. Cletus didn't feel like hanging around the schoolyard after school, watching boys he didn't know, and who showed no signs of wanting to know him, shoot baskets. So he came straight home, if you could call it that, even though there was nothing to do when he got there. He opened the door of the icebox, and a female voice called from the front room, "Cletus, you'll spoil your supper." So he closed the door again. There wasn't anything he wanted anyway, and went outdoors and sat on the back steps in the bleak sunshine. The teacher, who was not young or pretty, had given each of them a map of South America and told them to fill in the names of the countries and rivers, but Cletus didn't feel like it. With a stick, he drew crosses in the dirt, making life difficult for an ant who had business in that patch of bare ground. Though it had been going on for days, he was only now aware of a distant hammering. Bung, 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 kapung, 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 kapung. Somebody must be building a new house. Twisting the heel of his shoe, he erased the lines he'd drawn in the dirt, and with them the ant. Then he got up and went toward the hole in the back fence.